Malcolm Cole remembered the operation less as a sequence of orders and more as a narrowing of choices. Every decision after the drop had carried weight, but none had felt sudden once the fighting began. The enemy had occupied the world long enough to understand its roads, harvest districts, relay networks, and civilian movement patterns. The regiment had been inserted to break that control from behind the line, and Malcolm understood early that survival was secondary to creating disorder where the Tau had built routine. His full designation in the report was Trooper Malcolm Jaron Cole, attached to the Elysian Drop Troops under the Departamento Munitorum's airborne infantry classification. He held the rank of trooper at the time of the action, though the records noted that he had already completed multiple combat drops before deployment to the occupied agri world. His role was not command, not reconnaissance by formal assignment, and not heavy weapons support. He served as a line drop trooper within a dispersed strike element, trained to descend from high altitude, regroup under hostile conditions, and continue operating with limited resupply until relieved, extracted, or rendered combat ineffective. Malcolm was 27 standard years old during the operation. He was born on Elysia, raised within a culture where aerial insertion was treated less as a specialist method and more as an expected military inheritance. He stood slightly above average height, with a lean build shaped by grav harness training, endurance drills, and repeated exposure to low margin landings. His hair was dark brown and kept short under regulation. His skin carried the muted weathering common among soldiers who had spent more time under artificial light, troopship interiors, and polluted war zones than under stable planetary skies. The right side of his jaw bore a thin, pale scar from a canopy rupture during an earlier training incident, and his left forearm carried the faded ink mark of his intake cohort, partly obscured beneath old burn tissue. The report described him as controlled under stress, not unusually charismatic, and not prone to unnecessary speech. That assessment matched the observations of surviving personnel. Malcolm did not speak to steady others unless the situation required it. He did not perform confidence. His discipline was procedural. He checked straps, seals, weapon charges, ammunition counts, map slates, and squad signals in the same order before every descent. He trusted routines, because routines left fewer openings for fear to shape action. His family record was included because of Anna Cole, another member of the regiment and his younger sister by 3 years. Their shared surname was not incidental. Anna served in a separate fire team within the same operational grouping, and the two were not assigned together by request. Elysian regimental structures often contained family connections due to local recruitment patterns, but command doctrine discouraged emotional pairing, where mission flexibility could be compromised. Malcolm's report made no attempt to hide that her presence affected him. It simply noted that he acknowledged the distraction and continued functioning within acceptable operational limits. His combat role centered on close to medium-range infantry action after aerial insertion. He carried a standard pattern laser gun, modified for drop operations, with reinforced housing, secured power cell brackets, and a sling system designed not to foul during grav shoot deployment. His armor consisted of Elysian pattern flak protection, lighter than conventional line infantry equipment, and configured for mobility. The plating protected the torso, shoulders, and thighs without preventing rapid movement through irrigation trenches, field gantries, vehicle bays, or collapsed storage structures. His helmet included sealed optics, short-range squad Vox reception, and atmospheric filters suitable for dust, smoke, chemical residue, and crop treatment compounds common to agri worlds. He also carried a combat blade, 3 fragmentation grenades, 2 smoke charges, emergency ration blocks, a compact medica strip, and a locator beacon whose use was restricted unless extraction authorization was confirmed. The beacon mattered to him more than the report initially suggested. It represented the difference between ordered withdrawal and abandonment, but he understood that activating it too early would mark his position for enemy sweep teams as easily as it could guide Imperial aircraft. Malcolm's allegiance was recorded without complication. He served the Imperium of Man through the Astra Militarum under the authority of his regiment, his officers, and the wider invasion command preparing to retake the world from Tau occupation. His personal view of the enemy was practical rather than ideological in expression. He did not describe the Tau as monsters. He described them as organized, patient, technically capable, and dangerous because their systems turned conquered ground into predictable machinery. Their propaganda towers shaped civilian behavior. Their supply convoys moved with escort timing precise enough to make ambush difficult. Their patrols combined battlesuits, armored drones, fire warrior teams, and human auxiliaries who knew the roads better than any off-world soldier could. That was the enemy Malcolm believed he had been sent to damage. Not only soldiers, not only machines, but the occupation structure holding the agri-world in place before the main Imperial invasion arrived. In his account, his name, rank, and role mattered only because they explained where he stood when the drop began. He was one soldier among a full regiment released behind enemy lines by hundreds of Valkyrie assault carriers. His task was limited in wording and severe in consequence. Land alive, regroup if possible, sabotage assigned targets, assist resistance elements when contact could be verified, and keep moving until the invasion force turned scattered disruption into a front. Malcolm's assigned formation for the operation was a composite drop element drawn from the larger Elysian regiment committed to the rear line insertion. The regiment itself had been divided before launch into multiple descent waves, each assigned to a separate cluster of targets across the occupied agricultural belt. These targets included Tau communication relays, propaganda transmission towers, fuel distribution stations, drone maintenance depots, ammunition silos, and road junctions used by mechanized patrols. The main Imperial invasion force was not yet on the surface in strength. That meant the regiment's purpose was not to hold ground in the traditional sense. Its purpose was to make the ground unreliable before the larger assault began. Malcolm's immediate team was small enough to move without drawing excessive attention, and large enough to survive brief contact if the landing went cleanly. The core group identified in his report consisted of Malcolm Cole, Sky Dresdin, Ulfrik Barl, Anna Cole, and Via Falla. They were not the entirety of the local strike cell, but they formed the surviving center of the group Malcolm described most frequently in his account. Each had a defined function, though Elysian doctrine required every member to perform outside that function once separated from command. Sky Dresdin served as the team's practical lead during the descent phase. He held the rank of corporal and had more confirmed combat drops than the others in Malcolm's immediate file. Dresdin was 32 standard years old, narrow-faced, dark-skinned, and physically compact, with close-cropped black hair, and a voice that rarely rose above a controlled speaking volume. He carried the authority of a soldier used to giving orders in broken terrain, where officers were often distant, and Vox contact could fail within minutes of landing. Malcolm described him as methodical, severe, and useful because he did not mistake urgency for panic. Ulfrik Barl was the team's heavy support specialist. He came from a low-gravity mining settlement attached to Elysian recruitment routes, and his size made him easy to identify even beneath drop armor. He was broad-shouldered, pale, and heavy by the standards of grav-shoot infantry, though still within approved deployment weight. He carried a man-portable support weapon configured for suppression against infantry and light drones, along with extra power cells distributed among the team to reduce his descent load. His armor was reinforced around the shoulders and chest, making him slower than Malcolm over difficult ground, but more effective when the team needed to hold a narrow line of fire. Anna Cole served as a field signaler and secondary marksman. She was 24 standard years old, with the same dark hair as Malcolm, though cut shorter, and the same stillness under pressure that had been noted in their family intake records. Her equipment included a compact Vox unit, signal encryption slates, and a long-barrel las carbine, suitable for controlled shots across open agricultural rows and irrigation lanes. Her assignment placed her between combat and communications, a position that required her to listen more than speak. Malcolm's report treated her professionally, but the phrasing became more exact whenever her location was mentioned. He tracked her movement, even when he claimed not to. Via Fowler was the team's demolitions and entry specialist. She was 29 standard years old, born on Elysia, but raised for part of her life aboard Munitorum transport vessels due to family service obligations. She had light brown skin, grey eyes, and chemical burn marks on 2 fingers of her right hand from an earlier charge misfire. Her kit contained shaped charges, cutting paste, compact detonators, wire triggers, and Auspex tabs used to identify power flow through enemy infrastructure. She was not reckless. Malcolm specifically stated that Fowler treated explosives as a timing problem rather than a display of force. That made her valuable for sabotage work, where noise, blast direction, and delayed effect mattered more than immediate destruction. The team's logistical support before insertion was built around speed and denial. They were issued enough supplies for a short, independent operation, not an extended campaign. Each trooper carried water concentrate, ration blocks, Medici strips, replacement power cells, low-profile field blankets, and sealed ammunition packs. Heavier supplies were loaded into drop canisters marked for dispersed release. But command briefings made clear that the canisters could not be relied upon. Enemy air defense, wind shear, and landing scatter would separate men from equipment. Anything essential had to be carried on the body or considered already lost. Their transport wave was assigned to Valkyrie assault carriers operating in mass formation. Malcolm described the carrier interior as cramped, loud, and familiar. The troop bay smelled of machine oil, heated metal, rubber seals, and the stale breath of soldiers trying not to speak before the ramp opened. The Valkyrie was not built for comfort. It was built to bring soldiers through contested airspace, release them quickly, and withdraw before enemy tracking systems could concentrate fire. Harness locks held each trooper in place. Grav chutes were inspected twice by the soldier wearing them, and once by the trooper opposite. Malcolm inspected Anna's gear only through visual confirmation from across the bay, because stepping out of sequence would have drawn attention from Dresdin. The mission order was delivered before final approach through a combination of verbal briefing, encrypted slate packets, and target diagrams. The agri world had been under Tau occupation long enough for the enemy to establish administrative control over population centers and production districts. The Tau had not destroyed the planet's food infrastructure. They had reorganized it. Harvest outputs were redirected through monitored transport arteries. Local broadcasts encouraged cooperation. Human auxiliaries were used to secure settlements, identify dissenters, and translate occupation directives. Remaining planetary defense force elements had either gone underground, been absorbed, been executed, or scattered into isolated resistance pockets. The regiment's task was to fracture that control before the main Imperial invasion. Malcolm's team was assigned to a western agricultural processing zone bordered by irrigation canals, storage towers, worker hab blocks, and a rail spur converted for Tau supply movement. Their primary objective was to disable a propaganda transmission tower tied into a regional compliance network. Their secondary objective was to sabotage a supply relay station used to coordinate patrol routing between outlying farms and a larger Tau garrison. Their conditional objective was to establish contact with verified resistance fighters, including former Planetary Defense Force personnel, but only if doing so did not compromise the primary targets. The briefing was precise about what they were not to do. They were not to begin an open uprising before the invasion timetable advanced. They were not to hold civilian centers. They were not to transmit broad Imperial codes unless command authentication was received. They were not to engage heavy battlesuit units unless evasion was impossible. Their value was measured in disruption, not in bodies counted. The Tau could replace patrol losses faster than the regiment could replace trained drop troops behind the line. Malcolm recorded that the final order before descent was simple. Land outside the projected sensor envelope, regroup at marker point Lancer 9, confirm personnel, move under blackout conditions, observe the tower for 1 local hour, and strike only after patrol rotation created a gap. If the gap did not appear, the team was to create one through diversion, sabotage, or directed contact with local resistance. It was a clean order on the slate. Malcolm noted that clean orders rarely survived contact with occupied ground. Dresdin exited first. 2 more followed. Malcolm stepped into the slipstream after Ulfrik Barl and felt the aircraft vanish behind him as soon as his boots left the ramp. There was no transition gentle enough to remember as motion. There was only wind, darkness, and the immediate pressure of descent. His grav chute deployed with a controlled drag that caught his body and twisted him left before stabilizing. He adjusted by instinct, knees bent, arms tight, one hand near the steering grip, the other protecting his weapon from swinging loose. Below him, the agricultural district expanded from a map into a hostile surface. The fields were arranged in long, wet rectangles, broken by drainage cuts and low-service roads. The crops were shoulder-high in some sections and recently harvested in others, leaving exposed rows of stubble that reflected thin strips of moonlight. Processing towers stood to the east, their upper platforms marked by blue-white lamps. Farther north, he saw the propaganda tower, listed in the briefing, a tall, angular structure grafted onto an older Imperial communications mast. It transmitted in intervals, its signal lights pulsing with mechanical regularity. The landing scatter began almost immediately. Wind pushed Malcolm farther south than the projected descent lane. Tracer fire rose from somewhere beyond the canal road, not concentrated enough to indicate a prepared anti-air battery, but disciplined enough to confirm that the enemy had detected at least part of the drop. One Valkyrie crossed low in the distance, trailing smoke from its port side, still moving fast enough to clear the zone. Malcolm did not track it for long. Watching aircraft after exit was a good way to hit the ground unprepared. He landed in soft soil near the edge of an irrigation trench. The impact drove pain through his knees and hips, but the grav chute reduced it to something manageable. He released the canopy, pulled it down into the crop line, and cut away the main straps. His weapon came up before he fully stood. He listened first. Engine noise above. Wind through crop stalks. Distant weapons fire. A broadcast voice speaking in low Gothic from the propaganda tower, calm and measured, instructing local laborers to remain indoors for their safety. Malcolm checked his locator slate. The signal was degraded, but not dead. Dresdin's marker appeared northwest, intermittent. Anna's was closer, east of the trench line. Ulfrik's marker flickered and vanished, then returned farther off than expected. Firefoller's marker did not appear for several seconds, then registered south of the planned regroup path. The team was scattered, but not lost. He moved without activating full Vox transmission. The briefing had warned that Tau monitoring systems could identify careless emissions. He used short burst confirmation only, tight and coded. 1 pulse for alive, 2 for moving, 3 for contact. Anna answered first. Dresdin followed. Vio answered after a delay. Ulfrik's response came last, distorted but present. Malcolm began crossing the trench line toward marker point Lancer 9. His first minutes on the planet were defined by restraint. He had not yet seen the enemy directly. He had not yet reached the objective. He had not yet confirmed whether local resistance remained active in the district. The deployment had placed him behind enemy lines as intended, but not cleanly, and that distinction mattered. The operation had begun, but it had already become less orderly than the Slate version described. He recorded that the ground felt too open at first. The fields offered concealment from a distance, but little true cover against disciplined fire. The canals could hide movement, but also trapped sound. The roads were raised enough for patrols to observe the surrounding crop rows. Every structure had value. Every light source could be a sensor. Every civilian building might contain workers, collaborators, prisoners, or frightened families waiting to see which army arrived first. By the time Malcolm reached the first drainage culvert, the broadcast tower changed its message. It no longer spoke about agricultural compliance. It warned of unauthorized military activity and instructed all citizens to report sightings of Imperial personnel to local security cadres. Malcolm paused beneath the culvert lip, breathing through his filter, lasgun held close against his chest. That was when he understood that the regiment had achieved at least the first part of its purpose. The occupation system had noticed the drop. Now it had to react. Malcolm's first sustained assessment of the terrain began after the scattered members of the team reached the outer boundary of Marker Point, Lancer 9. The location was not a fixed landmark in the civilian sense. It was a convergence area selected from orbital survey, a shallow irrigation junction where 3 drainage channels met beneath a raised service road. From the air it appeared unimportant. From the ground, it offered limited overhead concealment, access to multiple routes, and enough acoustic distortion from moving water to mask quiet movement. That was why Dresdin had chosen it as the regroup point during the briefing. It was not safe. It was simply less exposed than the surrounding fields. The agri district was arranged with the efficiency of large-scale food production, but the occupation had altered how each feature functioned. The fields were not open wilderness. They were managed corridors of visibility and movement. Tall grain rows and nutrient crops created concealment at body height, while the raised service roads allowed patrols to observe movement above the crop line. Irrigation canals divided the land into long rectangular sectors. Some were shallow enough to cross with a short climb. Others had steep ferrocrete sides slick with algae and chemical residue, turning them into obstacles that slowed infantry and forced predictable crossing points. The air carried a wet mineral taste through Malcolm's helmet filter. Crop treatment compounds had settled over the lower fields after dusk, leaving a sharp chemical odor beneath the smell of mud, cut stalks, and stagnant canal water. The soil was soft where irrigation overflow had saturated the ground, but hard and cracked along the raised paths used by harvest machines. Every step had to be chosen. Moving through the fields reduced visual exposure, but the wet soil recorded boot marks clearly. Moving along the roads preserved speed, but turned the team into silhouettes against pale ground lamps and tau marker beacons. The weather favored neither side completely. Low cloud cover blocked clean observation from altitude and reduced the effectiveness of distant visual tracking. But it also trapped engine noise, broadcast sound, and weapons discharge close to the surface. Wind moved across the crop rows in slow pulses, strong enough to mask movement for a few seconds at a time, and weak enough to leave sudden silence between gusts. Malcolm learned to move during the sound, halt during the quiet, and let the field itself decide pace. That was not formal doctrine. It was adaptation under occupation conditions. The propaganda tower stood north of their position, fixed beside an older Imperial communications mast that had been reworked rather than demolished. Its original frame was still visible beneath smooth tau reinforcement panels and signal vanes. The tower rose above the storage blocks and irrigation pumps, high enough to broadcast across the surrounding labor settlements. It also served as an observation reference. Even when concealed, Malcolm could orient himself by the pulse of its lights through the crop haze. That made it useful and dangerous. Any soldier using it as a landmark had to assume the enemy did the same. To the east stood the agricultural processing complex. It consisted of grain intake bays, conveyor towers, storage silos, generator sheds, machine repair garages, and worker control offices. Under Imperial management, It would have been a logistical center for harvest transfer. Under Tau occupation, it had become a guarded supply node. Malcolm could see alterations even from a distance. Portable sensor masts had been installed on silo crowns. Blue-white lamps marked entry lanes. Light vehicles moved between the repair garages and the rail spur. The enemy had chosen the complex correctly. It connected food processing, fuel storage, transport control, and civilian labor oversight in one location. The rail spur ran behind the processing complex, extending toward a larger garrison beyond the district. It was not heavily active during Malcolm's initial observation, but its importance was obvious. Supply traffic that could not move by air or road would move through that line. Crates, drone parts, ration shipments, replacement armor plates, field generators, and communication equipment could all pass through the spur with less exposure than surface convoys. Destroying the rail itself would slow movement, but damaging its control systems would create broader confusion without requiring the team to hold the site. The secondary target, the supply relay station, sat southwest of the tower in a low rectangular structure that had once served as a harvest coordination office. The Tau had expanded it with external power conduits, aerial nodes, and a compact drone charging frame. It did not look significant beside the tower, and that was part of its value. The tower influenced the population. The relay station influenced the patrol schedule. It likely managed route updates, vehicle positioning, and signal traffic between smaller security posts. Disabling it could force patrols to rely on slower coordination and expose delays across the district. Dresdin used the terrain analysis without wasting speech. He positioned Ulfrik Barl near the culvert mouth, where the support weapon could cover the service road without revealing the whole team. Via Fala studied the route toward the relay station through her Auspex tabs, identifying where buried power cables followed the irrigation line. Anna Cole monitored short burst signals and attempted to separate Imperial resistance codes from occupation traffic. Malcolm was placed forward along the western canal edge, where he could observe the tower approach and the worker hab blocks beyond it. The worker hab blocks were the most complicated ground feature. They formed a cluster of low rectangular dwellings between two storage lanes, close enough to the tower to be monitored, and far enough from the processing complex to remain outside the main security perimeter. Lights were visible behind sealed windows. Malcolm saw no civilian movement in the open, which meant the tower warning had been obeyed or enforced. The team could not treat the habs as empty, and they could not treat them as friendly. Resistance fighters might be hidden there. Human auxiliaries might also be using the same buildings to watch for Imperial troops. The terrain gave the Elysians several advantages, but none were clean. Their drop training allowed them to operate without roads, which reduced dependence on predictable routes. Their lighter armor let them cross canals, culverts, and crop rows faster than standard infantry. Their small team size helped them slip between sensor arcs, designed to detect vehicles, and larger formations. The irrigation network gave them concealed movement lanes. The processing structures offered shadows, access ladders, maintenance trenches, and machine noise that could cover entry. The Tau advantages were different and more systematic. Their patrols had mapped the district. Their sensors were elevated. Their human auxiliaries understood local paths and civilian behavior. Their vehicles could use the raised service roads quickly. Their drones could inspect areas where a soldier would need to expose himself. They held the tower, the relay, the processing complex, and the road junctions. That meant they controlled the most useful points before the team ever arrived. Malcolm concluded that the terrain could support the mission only if the team treated the district as a sequence of temporary positions, rather than a battlefield to occupy. Holding ground would fail. Rapid movement without observation would fail. The correct method was controlled infiltration, short observation, limited sabotage, and immediate displacement before the enemy understood which target had been selected first. By the end of the first full terrain assessment, Dresdin had adjusted the mission approach. The team would not move directly on the propaganda tower. Its height, lighting, and likely sensor coverage made it too exposed for a first strike. They would approach the supply relay station through the western irrigation line, use Via's charges to interrupt patrol coordination, and allow the resulting confusion to create the opening needed for the tower. Malcolm accepted the change because it matched what the ground had already shown them. The tower was the visible symbol of occupation, but the relay was the weaker joint beneath it. First contact began before Malcolm saw a Tau soldier. The team had moved from Lancer 9 into the western irrigation line under controlled silence, using the canal wall as a visual break from the raised service road. The route was narrow, damp, and uneven. Water moved beside them in a slow channel thick with residue from crop treatment systems, and the ferrocrete edge forced each trooper to move in single file. Dresdin led, followed by Via Fowler, then Malcolm, then Anna Cole, with Ulfrik Barl maintaining rear security. The formation was not ideal for a sudden engagement, but it reduced their profile and allowed them to advance beneath the level of the road lamps. The first indication of enemy presence was a change in sound. Malcolm recorded a soft mechanical hum from above the canal lip, too regular to be wind and too light to be a vehicle engine. Dresdin halted the team with a closed fist. No one spoke. Malcolm lowered himself against the canal wall and looked up through a break in the crop line. A small drone passed over the service road, moving at walking speed, its underside optics rotating in short, measured intervals. It was not searching randomly. It was conducting a sweep pattern. The drone was oval, compact, and smooth in shape, with no wasted exterior structure. Its movement was quiet enough that an undisciplined patrol might have missed it entirely. Its casing reflected only a muted strip of tower light before it passed beyond the canal. Malcolm identified it as a sensor drone rather than a combat drone, though the distinction mattered less than it seemed. A sensor drone did not need to kill the team. It only needed to mark them. Dresdin waited until it moved east before advancing again. The team continued for another 70 meters before the second sign appeared. On the raised road ahead, the crop rows opened into a maintenance crossing where farm machinery could pass between field sectors. There, Malcolm saw the glow of Tau marker lenses through the ground haze. The patrol was moving south along the service road, not directly toward the relay station, but close enough to compromise the approach. Dresdin ordered the team into concealment with hand signals. Malcolm shifted into the shadow beneath a maintenance pipe. Anna settled beside him, her lascarbine angled upward, but not exposed. Via placed one hand over the charge satchel at her chest, keeping it from scraping the canal wall. Ulfrik went still near the rear, his support weapon lowered but ready. The patrol came into view in sections. The first visible elements were drones, 2 light units moving ahead of the main body. They floated at different heights, one close to the road surface and one above shoulder level, scanning the field edges and canal lines. Behind them walked fire warriors in segmented armor, their forms clean and disciplined beneath angular helmets. Their armor plates were pale ochre under the road lamps, with darker undersuit material visible at the joints. Each carried a pulse rifle held low but ready, the weapons longer and heavier than a lasgun, built around controlled energy output rather than rugged simplicity. Malcolm counted 6 fire warriors in the first file. Their movement was efficient and quiet. They did not speak in low Gothic. Their communication appeared to pass through helmet systems and short hand movements. They advanced with the confidence of troops who believed the road belonged to them, but not with carelessness. Their spacing reduced the effect of grenades. Their helmets shifted toward likely concealment points as they moved. They had been trained to expect resistance, even if they did not yet know where it waited. Behind them came human auxiliaries. Malcolm's description of the auxiliaries was more detailed than his description of the fire warriors, possibly because they unsettled him more. They wore mixed equipment, part local security gear, and part Tau-issued protection. Some carried lasguns of Imperial origin with modified power packs. Others carried shorter Tau weapons issued for occupation security. Their uniforms retained pieces of the Agri world's former planetary defense force pattern, but the insignia had been removed or covered with occupation markings. Their faces were visible beneath open helmets and cloth wraps. They were human, local, and armed in service of the enemy. There were 8 of them in the patrol segment Malcolm observed. They moved less cleanly than the fire warriors, but with greater familiarity toward the terrain. One pointed toward the irrigation crossing before the drones adjusted their path. Another checked the crop rows, not by scanning broadly, but by looking at the places a local worker might use to hide from overseers. Malcolm understood the danger immediately. Tau sensors could detect movement and heat. The auxiliaries could detect habits. A heavier shape followed at the rear of the patrol. At first, Malcolm thought it was a light vehicle moving behind the road rise. But as it cleared the haze, he recognized the outline of a battlesuit. It was smaller than the largest classes described in training briefings, but still taller and broader than any infantryman. Its limbs moved with servo-assisted stability, and its torso carried the balanced geometry of a machine built for mobile firepower. Weapon systems were mounted along one arm and shoulder hardpoint, though Malcolm could not identify the exact configuration from his angle. The battlesuit did not walk like a man in armor. It moved like a weapons platform with a pilot inside, correcting each step through systems faster than muscle. The team remained concealed. The patrol was not close enough to step on them, but it was close enough that a single mistake would begin the engagement on enemy terms. Malcolm felt mud pressing through the seam at his knee plate. He kept his breathing shallow through the filter. Anna's shoulder touched the canal wall beside him, motionless. Dresdin watched the lead drones. Via watched the gap beneath the road barrier, likely measuring whether a thrown charge could disable the patrol if detection became unavoidable. Ulfrik did not move at all. The first contact became active when the lower drone altered course. It slowed near the canal crossing, rotated its optics toward the irrigation line, and held position longer than its previous sweep interval. Malcolm did not know whether it had detected heat, sound, disturbed mud, or simple irregularity in the crop edge. Dresdin made the decision before the drone transmitted a wider alert. His left hand opened twice, then closed. Suppressed engagement. Immediate displacement. Anna fired first. Her lascarbine released one controlled shot that struck the lower drone beneath its optic housing. Malcolm fired at the upper drone a fraction later, aiming where its sensor cluster met the main casing. The first drone dropped hard onto the road surface. The second spun sideways, struck the road marker, and fell into the crop line. The fire warriors reacted with speed. Their rifles came up before the damaged drones stopped moving. Blue pulse fire cut into the canal, lip and crop rows, bright enough to flash across Malcolm's visor. Dirt, water, and shredded stalks struck his armor. He did not remain in place after firing. Dresdin had already signaled movement, and the team shifted along the canal rather than climbing into the road. That choice kept them from presenting a clear silhouette to the patrol. The human auxiliaries shouted in Low Gothic, ordering unseen Imperial troops to surrender and identify themselves. Their voices carried strain rather than confidence. They knew enough to be afraid of what a drop meant. The fire warriors did not shout. They advanced by position, using drones lost as confirmation of contact, and beginning to pressure the canal line with disciplined fire. Ulfrik answered from the rear with a short burst from his support weapon. He did not try to overwhelm the patrol. He cut across the road edge to force the fire warriors down and delay their advance. Via threw smoke into the canal bend, not between the team and the enemy, but behind the team to confuse any attempt to track their withdrawal path. Dresdin directed them toward a culvert branch that angled closer to the relay station. Malcolm's first impression of the enemy remained precise in the report. The Tau were not disorganized occupiers relying on fear alone. Their fire warriors were controlled. Their drones were useful. Their battle suit support changed the weight of the patrol, and their human auxiliaries made the terrain less friendly to Imperial movement. The enemy combined technology with local knowledge, and that combination made even a routine patrol dangerous. The team had not been stopped, but it had been identified as present within the district. Malcolm understood the consequence as he moved through the smoke and canal shadow. The relay station was still reachable. The tower was still standing. The mission order remained intact. But from that point forward, the occupied ground was awake. Malcolm's assessment of the team began only after they broke direct line of fire with the patrol and reached the culvert branch leading toward the relay station. Until that point, no one had been given permission to stop long enough to measure losses. The first rule after contact was movement. The second was silence. The third was confirmation. Dresdin enforced all three without raising his voice, using hand signals and short-coded pulses through Anna's Vox unit only when distance required it. The culvert branch was lower than the main irrigation line and half choked with sediment, maintenance debris, and shallow runoff. It forced the team to crouch as they moved, with weapon muzzles angled downward and packs scraping against damp ferrocrete. The smoke Via had placed behind them drifted unevenly through the canal bend, slowing visual pursuit but not preventing sensor sweep. Malcolm could still hear the Tau patrol above and behind them. Pulse fire came in controlled intervals rather than blind bursts, striking likely exit points and canal lips, where an undisciplined team might try to climb out. Dresdin called the halt beneath a broken pump, housing 30 meters from the relay station's western utility trench. It was the first place where the team had cover from the raised service road, partial concealment from the processing complex, and a clear route forward. Malcolm recorded that the halt lasted less than 2 minutes, but it contained the first hard accounting of the mission since landing. Ulfrik Barl had taken the worst damage during the withdrawal. A pulse round had struck the outer plate of his left thigh as he covered the team's movement. The armor had not failed completely, but the energy transfer burned through the plate seam and damaged the muscle beneath. He could still walk, but not quickly, and not without leaving a heavier trail in the mud. His support weapon remained functional. One feed coupling had been scorched by near impact, and its charge stability indicator flickered whenever he shifted grip. Ulfrik reported himself mobile. Dresdin accepted the report, but reassigned him from rear movement to fixed suppression for the next phase. Anna Cole had a shallow wound along the side of her neck, where ferrocrete fragments had entered beneath the helmet rim. The cut bled more than it impaired her, but blood inside a collar seal created its own problems. Malcolm saw her press a dressing pad into place with the one hand, while keeping the Vox receiver close to her ear with the other. She did not ask for help. He did not offer it. In the report, he stated that interfering with her task would have reduced team function. That was accurate, but incomplete. The more honest assessment was that if he stopped to treat her like his sister, he might hesitate later when she needed him to treat her like a soldier. Viafala had no visible wound, but one of her charge containers had been cracked during movement through the culvert. She checked the seals by touch, then separated 2 compromised cutting paste tubes from the rest of her kit. They could not be trusted for precision work. Her detonators were intact. Her main-shaped charges remained usable. Her Auspex tabs had picked up the relay station's power flow more clearly now that they were closer. She identified 3 external conduits entering the western wall, one buried feeder line from the processing complex, and one elevated signal mast connected to the roof array. Dresdin had taken a glancing hit across his left shoulder plate. The armor was scored, but serviceable. His command slate had cracked along one corner, though the stored map remained readable. Malcolm himself had no direct wound, only bruising from the landing, minor lacerations across one glove, and chemical mud forced into the lower seal of his right boot. His lasgun remained charged. He had spent 8 shots against the drones and suppression targets during withdrawal. He retained most of his ammunition, all 3 grenades, both smoke charges, and his emergency beacon. He marked the beacon again as unused. The team's supplies were reduced, but not broken. They had lost 1 shared ammunition pack when Ulfrik dropped it to maintain balance after the thigh hit. Via's compromised cutting paste reduced their options for silent entry. One of Anna's encryption slates had moisture damage from the culvert water, forcing her to rely on the backup unit. Food, water concentrate, and Medici strips remained sufficient for the immediate mission. But Malcolm understood that the operation was already shifting from planned sabotage into compressed execution. The longer they remained near the relay station, the more likely the patrol would triangulate their route. Dresdin's assessment was direct. The original approach had been compromised, but the enemy had not yet confirmed their objective. The patrol believed it had found an Imperial drop element moving through the irrigation network. It did not yet know whether the team was aiming for the relay station, the propaganda tower, or the processing complex. That uncertainty was the team's remaining advantage. They had to secure the relay station before the Tau converted contact into organized containment. The relay station itself sat ahead of them in a low administrative structure, built from older Imperial materials and modified with Tau systems. Its western side had fewer lights than the front entrance, but the utility trench feeding into it was exposed for 8 meters between the culvert branch and the wall. A drone charging frame stood near the southern corner, currently holding 3 inactive units. 2 human auxiliaries guarded the rear access door. Malcolm could see them through a gap between pipework and field grass. They were alert, but not fully alarmed, likely waiting for instructions from the patrol rather than expecting immediate assault. Dresdin chose speed over concealment. Via would move first under cover from Malcolm and Anna. She would place charges on the exposed conduits and the rear access lock. Ulfrik would establish a firing position beneath the pump housing and suppress the road if the patrol appeared. Anna would monitor enemy transmissions and call movement if the fire warriors shifted toward the relay. Malcolm would cover Via until the charges were set, then breach with Dresdin through the rear door if entry became necessary. The objective at this stage was not total destruction. It was functional paralysis. The relay station needed to stop coordinating patrol movement, drone routing, and local response. If its systems could be destroyed from outside, they would not enter. If the outer charges failed, they would breach and damage the interior control banks directly. Dresdin made clear that no one was to search for intelligence beyond immediate mission value. No trophies, no delays, no hero work. The line was spoken quietly, but every member understood it was mainly directed at the part of a soldier that wanted contact to mean retaliation. Via crossed the exposed trench first. Malcolm moved 2 steps behind and left of her, lasergun raised toward the rear door guards. Anna took position behind a pipe cradle and tracked the southern corner. Ulfrik settled his weapon onto the culvert edge, jaw tight from the pain in his leg, but hands steady. Dresdin remained between all of them, close enough to redirect the assault if the enemy reacted early. The first charge went onto the western conduit. The second went beneath the signal junction. Vaya worked quickly, pressing the shaped charge housings into place and checking the angle so the blast would cut inward through the relay's connections, rather than scatter outward across the trench. Malcolm watched the auxiliaries. One shifted his weight. The other turned his head slightly, possibly hearing movement beneath the wind and machinery hum. Anna gave the warning through a short pulse. Enemy patrol redirecting. Time closing. Dresdin signaled immediate breach preparation. Via placed the final charge on the rear access lock and armed the sequence. The auxiliaries reacted at last, one raising his weapon and shouting a challenge in low Gothic. Malcolm fired before the challenge finished. Anna fired with him. The rear door guard fell back against the wall, and the second dropped behind a crate stack, alive but suppressed. The charges detonated in a tight sequence. The conduit blast cut power along the western feed. The signal junction blew outward, in a hard flash of sparks and shattered casing. The rear lock charge punched the door inward, but did not fully clear it. Dresdin and Malcolm forced through together, boots striking broken metal, weapons raised into the dim interior. Inside, the relay station was smaller than Malcolm expected. It contained old Imperial control desks, stripped of most original fittings, replaced by smooth Tau consoles, signal processors, drone routing panels, and field coordination displays. Several human auxiliary technicians were inside, unarmored and shocked by the breach. One reached for a sidearm. Dresdin shot him. The others moved away from the consoles and lowered themselves to the floor when ordered. Via entered behind them and placed her remaining stable charges against the central processor bank. Anna called over the Vox that the patrol was now moving directly toward the relay station. Ulfrik opened fire from outside, controlled bursts echoing against the trench as he delayed their advance. Malcolm's assessment at that moment was simple. The team had casualties, but no dead. Supplies were reduced, but sufficient. The objective was inside their reach, but only for seconds. Securing it did not mean holding the building. It meant damaging the system beyond immediate repair and leaving before the enemy's heavier elements arrived. Via armed the charges. Dresdin ordered withdrawal. Malcolm took one final look at the relay displays before leaving and saw route lines across the district flickering red, then fragmenting as power dropped from the western feed. For the first time since landing, the occupation network showed disorder, not as theory, but as visible failure. The mission objective had been secured in the only way available to them. They had broken the relay, and now they had to survive the cost of breaking it. The execution of the primary mission objective began with the destruction of the relay station. But Malcolm did not describe the relay itself as the primary target. In his report, he treated it as the opening cut. The relay was the structure that allowed the visible occupation system to respond in sequence. The propaganda tower was the structure that allowed that system to speak. Destroying the tower was the assigned priority because it controlled civilian instruction across the district, carried compliance messaging to the labor blocks, repeated Tau administrative orders, and likely served as a retransmission point for local security notices. As long as it remained operational, the occupation could present itself as stable, even while the ground beneath it started to fail. The team withdrew from the relay station seconds before Via Fala's charges destroyed the central processor bank. The blast was contained by the building's reinforced walls, but its effects were immediate. External lights on the western side died first. The roof array sparked, pulsed once, then went dark. A second later, several road markers across the adjacent service lane lost synchronization. Malcolm saw the shift from the irrigation trench. The Tau network had not gone blind, but it had lost one of the local organs that kept its movements coordinated. Ulfrik Barl continued to suppress the road while withdrawing backward into the culvert branch. His wounded leg reduced his pace, and Malcolm moved to support him only after Dresdin gave the hand signal. Ulfrik did not argue. Pride had no useful place inside the next phase. The enemy was already redirecting. Pulse fire struck the relay station's rear wall, then the pipework above the trench, indicating that the fire warriors had not yet gained clean visual contact, but were narrowing the team's route. Dresdin did not attempt to return toward Lancer 9. That path was now too obvious. Instead, he led the team north along a maintenance drainage line that ran beneath a series of grain conveyor structures. The route had been marked as secondary during briefing, but only for emergency movement. It brought them closer to the propaganda tower at the cost of moving nearer to the processing complex. Malcolm understood the choice. The patrol behind them was dangerous, but the damage to the relay had created a temporary delay in wider coordination. If they moved immediately, the tower could be reached before the enemy fully understood the team's next target. The tower was built into the skeleton of an older Imperial communications mast. Its lower base remained square, heavy, and practical, with access hatches designed for human maintenance crews. Above that, the tower additions changed the profile into something cleaner and more angular. Broadcast vanes extended from the upper section. External power conduits ran along the eastern support struts. A small control annex had been installed beside the foundation, likely used by auxiliary operators and earth-cast technicians responsible for keeping the system aligned with the occupation grid. The tower continued broadcasting even after the relay station fell. Its voice carried over the fields in calm, low Gothic, instructing workers to remain inside, warning against contact with hostile Imperial infiltrators, and promising protection to compliant citizens. Malcolm recorded that the tone of the broadcast was more disturbing than open threat would have been. It did not sound frightened. It sounded administrative. It assumed obedience as a normal condition. The team reached a machine shed 200 meters from the tower base and conducted their final observation. No one called it a rest. Ulfrik lowered himself against a stack of fertilizer drums and tightened the dressing around his thigh. Anna's neck wound had slowed, but not sealed cleanly. Via counted her remaining charges with visible irritation, not panic. Dresdin studied the tower through magnified optics, while Malcolm covered the southern approach. The tower security was lighter than it would have been under full alert, but not soft. Malcolm observed 4 human auxiliaries near the annex entrance, 2 more at the vehicle lane, and at least 3 fire warriors positioned under the tower's lower platform. A drone moved in a slow, vertical pattern along the mast, inspecting the support structure and the transmission vanes above. There was no battlesuit at the tower base yet. That absence shaped the assault plan. If a battlesuit arrived before the charges were placed, the team would likely lose the chance to complete the objective. Dresdin's plan was adapted from the available tools rather than from the original slate. Via would not attempt to climb the tower or enter the annex unless forced. The remaining charges would be placed at the external power conduits and lower support junctions, enough to disable transmission and damage the tower's alignment systems. Total collapse was not required. A dead tower served the mission. A visibly damaged tower served it better, but visibility could not be prioritized over survival. Anna would initiate the distraction. Using the damaged but functional backup encryption slate, she transmitted a brief false contact burst from a location south of the tower, routed through a captured auxiliary channel fragment detected after the relay station's failure. The signal was crude, but the timing mattered more than perfection. It suggested Imperial movement away from the true approach. 2 auxiliaries at the vehicle lane reacted first, turning toward the false signal. 1 fire warrior shifted position beneath the platform. The drone paused its vertical scan and moved outward to investigate. That was the opening. Malcolm and Dresdin moved first through the shadow of the machine shed and across a strip of harvested field. The ground was exposed, but the tower lights were facing outward, not down. Via followed low behind them, charge satchel tight against her chest. Anna remained in the shed, watching the annex and maintaining the false signal in short, irregular pulses. Ulfrik covered the southern service road from behind the fertilizer drums. His support weapon braced to compensate for his injury. The first auxiliary near the annex saw movement when Malcolm was less than 30 meters from the foundation. The man raised his weapon and shouted. Malcolm fired twice, striking him before the warning became detailed. Dresdin engaged the second guard. The fire warriors reacted immediately, pulse rifles turning toward the field edge. Via did not slow. Malcolm shifted to draw fire away from her, dropping behind an irrigation pump, housing as blue energy rounds burned across the metal casing. The exchange lasted only seconds, but each second changed the objective window. Anna fired from the shed and struck one fire warrior along the lower platform. Ulfrik opened with a controlled burst across the vehicle lane, forcing the remaining auxiliaries into cover and preventing them from flanking Via's approach. Dresdin advanced in short movements, firing only when a target exposed itself. He did not try to win the firefight. He tried to keep the enemy's heads down long enough for Via to work. Via reached the first conduit and placed a charge at the junction, where Tau reinforcement casing met the older Imperial mast. She moved to the second point under direct fire, using the tower's own foundation as cover. Malcolm saw sparks snap from the wall near her shoulder. She did not look at the impact. She set the second charge, checked the angle, and armed it. The third charge had to go on the external alignment control housing beside the annex door. That was the most exposed placement, and the enemy understood its importance by then. The drone returned from the false signal sweep faster than expected. It crossed above the field and angled toward Via. Malcolm fired at it, but missed the first shot. Anna hit it with the second, damaging its stabilizer, but not destroying it. The drone dipped, recovered, and began transmitting a warning tone. Dresdin stepped out from the pump housing and shot it at close range before it could complete whatever marking sequence it had begun. The final charge was placed by hand against the control housing. Via armed it, then struck the casing twice to ensure magnetic lock. Dresdin gave the withdrawal signal immediately. Malcolm threw one smoke charge between the lower platform and the field approach, not to hide the tower, but to break the fire warrior's firing line long enough for Via to move. The smoke expanded unevenly in the wet air, carrying the chemical taste of its canister through Malcolm's filter. The charges detonated in sequence after the team cleared the foundation by less than 20 meters. The first blast severed the lower power conduit. The second tore through the reinforced junction and sent fragments of Tau paneling across the field. The third destroyed the alignment control housing and threw the tower's broadcast into distortion. The calm, low Gothic voice stretched into static, repeated half a sentence, then cut out entirely. Malcolm did not look back until Dresdin ordered the team into the drainage line. When he did, he saw the tower still standing, but dead in function. Its lights flickered without rhythm. One broadcast vane had shifted off angle. Smoke rose from the base. The annex door hung open, and the remaining defenders were still firing into the field without a clean target. The primary mission objective had been executed. The tower was not erased from the skyline, but its authority had been broken. For the civilians in the hab blocks, for the hidden resistance cells, and for the Tau commanders trying to hold the district together before the Imperial invasion, that silence mattered. Malcolm recorded no satisfaction. He wrote only that the district became quieter after the broadcast failed, and that the absence of the tower's voice made every distant weapon discharge easier to hear. The route to extraction did not begin as a retreat. Malcolm described it as a continuation of the mission under reduced options. The propaganda tower had been disabled, the relay station had been broken, and the local occupation grid had lost a portion of its coordination. But the team remained behind enemy lines, with an active patrol closing from the south and additional response units likely moving from the processing complex. The objective was complete. The task now was to preserve enough of the team to report confirmation and, if possible, continue disruption until extraction became available. Dresdin chose not to activate the locator beacon immediately. The decision was practical rather than cautious. A beacon would guide Imperial aircraft, but it would also announce the team's fixed position to every Tau sensor platform still functioning in the district. The Valkyries that had carried the regiment in were not circling overhead, waiting for individual recovery. They had withdrawal corridors, fuel limits, enemy air defense concerns, and other scattered units across the agricultural belt. Extraction had to be requested from a location that could be reached, held briefly, and abandoned if compromised. The tower base did not qualify. Neither did the relay station. The team moved north through the drainage line, then cut west beneath a conveyor bridge, where harvested grain had once passed toward the processing silos. The machinery above them still operated in irregular cycles, creating heavy mechanical noise that helped cover their movement. Malcolm noted that the sound was useful, but disorienting. It drowned out distant footsteps, vehicle engines, and drone movement. It protected them from being heard, but also reduced their own ability to detect pursuit. Every advantage carried a debt. Their supplies were counted while moving, not while resting. Malcolm had one smoke charge remaining, 3 fragmentation grenades, a mostly charged lace gun, and enough ration and water concentrate for several hours of hard movement if rationing remained strict. Anna had 2 full power cells and 1 partial, but her backup encryption slate was losing clarity after repeated burst transmissions. Ulfrik had ammunition for his support weapon, though less than he preferred, and the damaged feed coupling was growing less stable with heat. Vaya had no remaining primary-shaped charges. She retained detonators, a small amount of cutting paste, wire, and 2 compact breaching charges unsuitable for heavy infrastructure, but still useful against doors, light vehicles, or exposed equipment. Dresdin had his sidearm, lace gun, cracked command slate, and the authority to decide which losses could still be spent. The team's physical condition had worsened in measurable ways. Ulfrik's thigh wound was slowing him. He could move under his own strength, but his stride was shorter, and each uneven surface forced a correction through his whole body. Anna's neck wound had stopped bleeding heavily, but her voice had become lower and rougher when she transmitted. Vaya's breathing remained controlled, but Malcolm saw stiffness in her right hand, where the old burn scars had tightened after prolonged work with charges and wet equipment. Dresdin's shoulder impact limited his left arm when climbing. Malcolm's right boot seal had degraded enough that cold canal water had entered during the last drainage crossing, numbing his toes and increasing the risk of slipping on metal surfaces. Time became the main pressure. The primary objective had been executed within the expected broad window, but the compromised approach and relay breach had consumed more movement time than planned. The team had less than 1 local hour before the first projected extraction review window, assuming command still received partial operational signals from the regiment. They had no guarantee their assigned extraction corridor remained usable. They had no confirmation that other teams in the district were intact. The loss of the propaganda tower would draw attention, and the tower would understand that the strike element responsible could not be far from the tower base. Dresdin directed them toward an abandoned pump station, listed during briefing as Extraction Option Cinder 4. It sat beyond the western irrigation belt, near a dry reservoir and a maintenance landing strip once used by crop survey aircraft. The strip was too small for heavy transport, but a Valkyrie could land briefly if the approach remained clear. More likely, the team would need a low-pass extraction or marked pickup under fire. Malcolm did not record optimism. He recorded distance, time, and obstacles. The first obstacle was the worker hab block district. Avoiding it would add too much time. Passing through it risked contact with civilians, auxiliaries, or resistance cells whose loyalty could not be confirmed in the dark. Dresdin chose the outer edge, moving through service alleys between water tanks and storage sheds. The tower's silence had changed the atmosphere. Windows that had been closed earlier now showed narrow breaks in curtains and door slats. People were watching. Malcolm saw faces for less than a second at a time. Most were pale from indoor light, tired and expressionless with fear. No one called out. No one cheered. No one reported them in those first minutes. Near the last hab row, an older man in a worker's coat stepped into the alley and raised both hands. Malcolm nearly fired. Dresdin stopped him with a sharp hand signal. The man spoke quickly in Low Gothic and identified a drainage bridge west of the settlement that had been blocked by auxiliaries after the tower attack. He also named a footpath through a storage orchard that would bypass the road. Anna checked his phrasing against resistance countersigns from the briefing. He did not know the full code, but he knew enough of the old Planetary Defense Force challenge response to suggest contact with loyalist remnants. Dresdin accepted the information without accepting the man as secure. No names were exchanged. No promises were given. The team moved on. The storage orchard was not an orchard in the old natural sense. It was a cultivated line of low nutrient trees used to stabilize soil and supplement processed feedstock. Their trunks were thin, pale, and evenly spaced. Their leaves smelled bitter when crushed under boots. The ground beneath them was firmer than the fields, which helped Ulfrik, but the spacing created long sight lines between rows. Malcolm hated it immediately. It was too orderly, too easy to search with optics, and too quiet after the machinery noise near the conveyor bridge. A drone passed overhead midway through the orchard. The team froze beneath the trees, using the pale trunks and shadow bands to break their outlines. The drone did not descend. It moved east toward the hab blocks, likely following reports or scanning for heat signatures near the tower. Malcolm understood then that the disabled relay had not blinded the enemy. It had delayed them, confused local routing, and forced wider search patterns. That was enough, but only barely. They reached the dry reservoir with 23 minutes remaining before the earliest extraction window. Cinder 4 lay beyond it, a low pump station beside cracked ferrocrete and rusted landing markers. The area looked open, but not empty. Vehicle tracks crossed the old strip, fresh enough to matter. Tau patrols had used the site recently, possibly because any competent enemy would know that open strips near sabotage zones could become extraction points. Dresdin ordered the team into the reservoir depression rather than onto the strip. From there, Anna attempted a tight burst transmission to higher command. The first signal failed. The second returned partial acknowledgement. The third carried their confirmation code. Relay disabled, tower silent, team mobile. Extraction requested at Cinder 4 with enemy presence probable. Malcolm recorded the final handicap clearly. They had reached the extraction zone with wounded personnel, reduced charges, limited ammunition, degraded communications, and a site that could not be trusted. They had time, but not enough to prepare properly. They had cover, but not enough to survive a prolonged engagement. They had completed the mission, but completion had drawn the enemy toward them. When the distant sound of engines reached the western sky, Malcolm could not tell whether they belonged to Imperial aircraft or Tau response craft. Dresdin did not ask him to guess. He ordered fields of fire instead. The team spread along the reservoir lip, facing the landing strip, the Hab Road, and the orchard line they had just crossed. Extraction was now possible, which made the position more dangerous than it had been at any point since landing. The first aircraft sound resolved into 2 separate engine signatures before either machine became visible. Malcolm identified the lower, heavier rhythm first. It belonged to a ground vehicle or low-flying skimmer moving beyond the orchard line, too close to be ignored and too slow to be Imperial air support. The second sound came from higher altitude, broken by wind and cloud cover, with the sharper engine note of a Valkyrie descending under controlled thrust. Dresdin made the same judgment without discussion. The team was not waiting for extraction alone. Anna's Vox unit received a partial return signal from the approaching Imperial aircraft. The message was incomplete, disrupted by terrain and enemy interference. But the essential parts were clear enough. A Valkyrie from a recovery element was inbound for a limited window. It would not land unless the strip was marked and the immediate approach was clear. If the zone could not be confirmed, it would pass and continue to another extraction marker. There would be no second guarantee. Dresdin ordered Malcolm and Via to move toward the landing markers, while Anna remained in the reservoir depression to maintain signal contact. Ulfrik stayed on the lip with his support weapon braced across a broken ferrocrete slab, covering the orchard and the road beyond it. Dresdin positioned himself between the strip and the pump station, where he could see both the team and the most likely enemy approach. The strip was worse up close than it had appeared from the reservoir. Its surface was cracked, warped by years of maintenance neglect and heavy agricultural use. Rusted landing lights protruded from the ground at uneven intervals. Most were dead. 2 still flickered with weak reserve power, enough to create visible points, but not enough to guide an aircraft under combat conditions. Via examined the nearest control box, opened it with a compact tool, and determined that the old Imperial circuit still held a charge. She did not have time for proper repair. She used wire from her demolitions kit to bypass the damaged relay and forced 3 more markers to light. Malcolm moved ahead of her, laser gun raised, scanning the pump station, the road, and the storage sheds beside the strip. The area smelled of dry dust, old fuel, and stagnant water trapped somewhere below the station floor. The wind had shifted, carrying smoke from the broken tower across the district in thin layers. The tower itself was not visible from Cinder 4, but its silence remained present in the way no instructions filled the air. The occupation broadcast had stopped. In its absence, every engine, every distant shot, and every human movement seemed clearer. The enemy reached the orchard before the Valkyrie reached the strip. The first shapes visible between the pale trunks were human auxiliaries moving in a loose line, guided by a hovering drone that swept ahead of them. Behind them came the heavier silhouette Malcolm had heard earlier. A Tau light skimmer or patrol vehicle moving low over the uneven ground, its hull partially obscured by foliage and dust. Fire warriors followed in disciplined intervals, not rushing, not shouting, maintaining spacing as they advanced toward the reservoir and landing strip. They had not arrived in overwhelming number, but they had arrived soon enough to contest the extraction. Ulfrik fired first, a controlled burst that cut across the orchard entrance and forced the auxiliaries to ground. Anna followed with precise shots from the reservoir edge. Dresdin ordered Malcolm and Via back from the marker box, but Via had not finished. She needed 1 more line active to give the Valkyrie a clean visual reference. Malcolm held beside her, firing at the drone as it moved through gaps between the trees. His first shot missed. His second struck the drone's casing, but did not destroy it. The third hit the optic cluster and dropped it into the orchard soil. The Valkyrie appeared through low cloud from the west, coming in fast and low with its nose angled slightly down before leveling over the reservoir. Its engines threw dust across the cracked strip. For a moment, the aircraft looked too large for the landing zone, too exposed and too late. Then its side weapon mounts opened fire into the orchard edge. The sound struck the entire extraction site like a physical impact. Dirt, bark, and fragments of light cover erupted around the advancing enemy line. The fire warriors dispersed immediately, their formation breaking into smaller firing positions. Anna transmitted the landing confirmation. Via forced the last marker active and pulled away from the control box as pulse fire struck the ground behind her. Malcolm caught her by the shoulder strap and dragged her toward the reservoir depression when she stumbled. She did not fall. She shoved his arm off once she regained balance and continued moving under her own strength. The Valkyrie did not fully settle. Its landing gear touched the strip only long enough to stabilize the troop bay ramp. The pilot held the aircraft under strain, engines screaming against dust and crosswind. The ramp dropped, and 2 crewmen inside signaled with hard, impatient gestures. There was no space for ceremony. No one checked names. No one asked for a formal report. Extraction was measured by bodies crossing the ramp before enemy fire closed the window. Dresdin ordered Anna aboard first, because the Vox unit and mission confirmation codes were with her. Via followed. Then Malcolm moved to assist Ulfrik. Ulfrik had risen from the reservoir lip and was moving with difficulty, his wounded leg dragging more visibly now that the final exertion had stripped away discipline's cleaner appearance. He refused to hand off the support weapon until Dresdin ordered it. Malcolm took part of his weight under the shoulder, and together they crossed the open stretch toward the ramp. Pulse fire struck the strip around them. One shot hit close enough to burn through the edge of Malcolm's cloak cover and score the rear plate of his armor. Another struck the ramp frame as they reached it, sending sparks across Ulfrik's helmet. The Valkyrie's crew hauled Ulfrik inside by his harness. Malcolm turned back once, not from sentiment, but to confirm Dresdin's position. Dresdin was the last to board. He withdrew backward, firing in controlled single shots toward the pump station road, where a second group of auxiliaries had begun to flank the extraction site. He entered the ramp at the moment the aircraft began to rise. One crewman seized his armor strap and pulled him clear as the ramp started closing. The Valkyrie lifted before the door had fully sealed. The climb was violent. The aircraft banked away from the strip, low enough that Malcolm felt the shift of ground fire beneath them, before altitude created distance. Inside the bay, no one spoke for several seconds. Ulfrik was secured to the deck by two crewmen and treated for the thigh wound. Anna sat with her back against the wall, one hand still locked around the Vox unit. Vaya checked her satchel by habit, though most of the tools that had mattered were gone. Dresdin stood longer than necessary before allowing himself to sit. Malcolm recorded that the moment of extraction did not feel like victory. It felt like interruption. The mission had ended for their team because the aircraft had arrived, not because the war beneath them had resolved. Through the small viewport, he saw sections of the Agri district passing below. Field grids, canal lines, worker blocks, the processing complex, and faint smoke rising where the relay station had failed. Farther away, intermittent flashes marked other engagements from other drop elements. The regiment was still fighting across the occupied belt. The debriefing began aboard the Valkyrie before they reached the rear staging point. A Munitorum intelligence officer attached to the recovery element recorded verbal confirmation, while a Medici assistant worked around injuries. Dresdin gave the formal sequence first. Relay station disabled. Propaganda tower rendered non-functional. Resistance contact possible but unconfirmed. Enemy patrol composition included fire warriors, human auxiliaries, drones, and at least one battlesuit operating in district response. Anna provided transmission logs and the partial authentication record from the extraction request. Via reported charge placement and assessed the relay damage as severe enough to disrupt local coordination for several hours at minimum. Ulfrik confirmed enemy pressure from the orchard and the presence of a light skimmer or patrol vehicle at extraction. Malcolm's own debrief was narrower. He was asked to describe enemy movement, terrain effects, civilian behavior, and the condition of the team during withdrawal. He reported that the Tau had adapted quickly once contact was made, but that the relay's destruction had slowed the precision of their response. He reported that local civilians had not interfered with the team, and that one unidentified worker had provided route information consistent with loyalist resistance knowledge. He did not classify the worker as resistance. He stated only that the information had aided movement to extraction. When asked for casualty status, Malcolm gave the answer plainly. No confirmed team deaths, multiple wounds, reduced equipment, objective complete. He did not include relief in the statement. Relief was not useful to the record. The final notation in Malcolm Cole's transcript stated that the district's occupation network had suffered localized disruption before the main Imperial invasion made contact with the wider agricultural belt. The tower's silence spread faster than the damage itself. Workers heard the absence. Resistance remnants heard it. Tau commanders heard the gap where their own instructions should have been. Malcolm did not claim that one team had changed the war alone. He understood the scale too well for that. He stated only that the regiment had been dropped behind enemy lines to make occupation unstable before the invasion arrived. In his sector, for the hours that mattered, they had done so.